AV news, let's move over to that. This is a little bit of cinema news, actually, but quite important, Ian.
Yeah. I guess a lot of people might have seen stories over the weekend about Cineworld Group. Lots of kind of quite a little bit over the top exaggerated stories about their impending closure. But essentially, the company has confirmed reports that it is considering filing for bankruptcy. Should point out, it doesn't mean that it's closing down. The company is still very keen to emphasize the fact that it's still very much business as usual for the near future, at least. But it has said it's in discussions with shareholders over the possibility of liquidation or some kind of financial restructuring, for the very obvious reason that it's struggled to get people back to the door since the post-COVID era. It did temporarily close a lot of its cinemas back in, I think it was October 2020, reopened again April 2021. But yeah, numbers aren't quite hitting what they expected, despite some,
let's face it, the movies haven't been great either. So, there hasn't been a great pool to get people in. I've been once since cinemas reopened, and that was for Top Gun. Haven't been anything else. So you can see why they're struggling.
I did quote, I think it was described as a limited slate of films that doesn't really show any signs of improving between now and I think November they mentioned. So they don't really have high hopes of those figures going up anytime soon. So obviously there's things in the pipeline that they'll need to address to get themselves back on foot.
Yeah. Of course, we have to point out as well that this is more US news based at the moment, but it will obviously affect the UK operations and so on in some way as well, and because it is the actual group that we're talking about here. And they also own other cinema chains. I think Picture Houses is definitely one, or Picture House is definitely one of the chains that Cineworld has as well. So hopefully they can restructure and come back fighting. We don't want to lose cinemas. It's still a great experience going watching films with other people. I know some people's idea of hell, but
it does amuse me that apparently it would appear that I've been to cinema twice as much as you have, because I saw June, or whatever you want to say.
All right.
So,
okay, yeah.
But yeah, look, there is an existential issue now that we, any would-be refinancing is going to have to sort out, because obviously when's I saw a Twitter advert for it today. Love and Thunder is on Disney Plus in a week and a bit.
Yeah. That's the other problem, isn't it? A lot of these films now have a very short window between theatre and streaming.
Yes. And when it comes down to, if I know that that's the case, he says, dropping his phone enthusiastically on the floor. If I know that's the case, I'm sorry, it doesn't really matter. For all but the biggest of big ticket items, the Top Guns, the sequel to Dune, I will go and see as well. I'm just not going. I'm sorry, it's as simple as that. It's we have various pressures on our personal finances, and it's something that is, I don't know how they're going to square this particular circle. My gut feeling is it's more about bringing older films to a cinema experience than it is new big ticket items.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because obviously there's two big Spielberg films coming back in IMAX next month. Very tempted to get tickets. So Jaws is coming back in IMAX. I think it's the 9th of September. Certainly for Odeon up here, it's 9th of September. And then beginning of September is E.T. in IMAX. Now, these films were never filmed with IMAX cameras or in the IMAX standard, so I don't know what they've done. They've maybe run it through the IMAX Enhanced program where it's been remastered for digital projection and so on. There could be some of that. I haven't seen any technical specs or so on, but yeah, E.T. and Jaws coming back to the cinema. They're in IMAX. They were never shot in IMAX, so God knows what they're going to look like. But just seeing them on the big screen again might be interesting enough. But I think you're onto something there, and I think there is a bit of a nostalgia thing where people perhaps will go and see the old classics again if they are, remastered and re-released on the big screen. So, but anyway, best of luck to Cineworld. Hopefully they don't disappear. But if you're in a home cinema, you've never had it is so good, and that's probably one of the biggest problems. If you got a projector and a big screen and a big audio system, and a streaming service like Disney Plus, you can watch Lightyear in Dolby Atmos and on a big screen. And why do you need to go to the cinema?
So I'm sure that the hardware team already covered this, but seeing as with the movie team, I thought we'd just dip into it a little bit. This is the Cineworld news, which my take on is, it's a little bit past its date. A brief background on the Cineworld situation. A group came in and bought Cineworld and Picture House in the UK. Their intention, which they succeeded in, was to become a massive player in the cinema industry. And they ended up owning the second largest number of screens in the whole world. So they did succeed in that. But they bought up Cineworld and Picture House, and then they moved on to the US and bought up Regal, and then they moved on to Canada and tried to buy up Cineplex, I think,
The greedy swines.
went wrong. But their intention, a little bit Netflix style, was massively overspending with a hope that it would all come good in the end. They ran into a number of problems. There were problems with the valuation on Cineworld, so that immediately put them behind to the tune of several hundred million. And then there were problems when it was declared that it was a monopoly for the owners to have Cineworld and Picture House running in the same towns and cities. So even though they owned Cineworld and Picture House, they had to decide which one of those was going to exist. And in some cases, that meant two Cineworlds would suddenly spring up, which doesn't make any sense to the average punter, but that's how the monopoly world works. So they screwed up there. And then they got Regal, but they had huge problems with the Regal chain because a lot of the cinemas were run down and declared unfit for use, and they couldn't bring them all back to life. And then the last ditch attempt was to buy this Canadian chain, and then COVID struck. So they reneged on the deal and ended up, I think they lost like $1.5 billion and still didn't get the cinemas. So they ended up in a world of pain before COVID. Now, COVID meant they just closed their screens and, buckled down and hoped that at the end of COVID, it would be okay. And I have to say, it's not great, but we've seen with Bond, we've seen with Maverick, and we've seen with Nope and Thor, there are people going to the cinemas, and there are people going to cinemas in reasonably healthy numbers, not the kind of numbers that are going to fix billions and billions of debt. So I think that the Cineworld issue is a much bigger picture than just COVID caused this.
It's not just that as well. Like the results of the closure of Cineworld and Picture House, well, if it goes, it's looking increasingly likely, but still an if in the UK. Is that Picture House has a distribution arm. One of the titles of which is The Feast. It's Gwynedd, by the way, Mark. That's how you pronounce the Welsh.
Good Welsh knowledge, TD. Diolch yn fawr. Iechyd da.
Da iawn. So yeah, it's that they have distribution deals as well in place, and it's not yet clear how the closure of whether or not the theatre arm of Picture House closing will affect the distribution arm, and if it does, that's access to interesting independent films that doesn't exist anymore. That they will have to go somewhere else. It's one fewer option to get distribution on these interesting and frequently like really good independent films. So it's a real concern.
It is. It's a mess of a situation, and as they've become the owners of the second largest number of screens in the world, if the second largest number of screens in the world shuts, I think a lot of studios are going to be concerned about where their Avatar sequels are going to be playing. Sorry, I didn't mean to single that one out for the 10 Avatar movies we're going to get over the next 5 years. But there's got to be some talk about how they do this, because it's not as simple as one of the streaming studios buying them out, because it's actually the studios that are more interested in cinema releases that are going to be more interested in what happens to cinema.
Yeah, it wasn't so long ago that people were predicting that cinema chains were soon going to be Disney houses, where Disney would control all the content and release all the Disney and 20th century films and all of that stuff, and they would have a monopoly on theaters. But that's looking increasingly unlikely as they give less and less of a shit about theatrical releases.
Yeah, but if they wanted to, they could swoop in, take the second largest number of screens in the world, and become Disney at the cinema, and launch with Avatar at Christmas.
Well, let's be honest. I think the likelihood of it being Disney, I think the likelihood of it being something like Amazon or something like that
Oh my goodness.
will be more more sensible. But I mean, ultimately, the studios need cinemas to generate the $1 billion revenues. Try as they like, they will not get the $1 billion revenues per film from the likes of streaming subscribers or even digital sales or anything like that. So it is in the studio's best interest to maintain the theatrical experience. And ultimately, you know, I think we may have fewer cinemas without a doubt, but I think cinemas will not go away anytime soon because, frankly, Hollywood cannot afford them to go away.
I'd agree with that.
Soon.
And also, we don't need 2 Cineworlds per town, which is what happened in a lot of locations. We probably don't need to go that far. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Absolutely.
But I do think that the news is a bit after the fact because they've been in trouble for a long time.
Yeah, that they were because of the loans that they had to take out during COVID. Even at the beginning of lockdown, there was talk about Cineworld being in trouble, where maybe other chains weren't. So they've been on the rocks for a while.
They're already in the hole. Right. Well, on that happy note, let's
go to the cinema, everyone. Go to the cinema.